Thank you, Arnold. Good afternoon, everyone. Alice's Stepsister, the history of the Appleton edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I'm going to talk about how this book, the 1865 Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, London, Macmillan imprint, became this book, the 1866 Appleton, New York, Daniel Appleton and Company edition of Alice. To do that, I shall outline the chronology of the publication, but first the two title pages. This is the title page of the London 1865 edition, and this is the title page of the same book, different title page, the New York D. Appleton and Company. To do that, to show how that 1865 book became the 1866 book, I shall outline the chronology of the publication of the 1865 Alice and the sale of the, in 1866, of the 1865 sheets to William Appleton, grandson of the founder of the publishing house of Daniel Appleton. Then I'll briefly discuss the two variants of the title page and show the evidence for the books having been bound in England. Next, I shall explain the marketing of the Appleton Alice, its notices, announcements of publication, and early reviews, followed by some statistics on the number of copies of the book sold at auction over a century, the number of books remaining today, and finally, how the Appleton Alice almost did not come to be. So first, the chronologies of the London imprint and its sale. June 27th, 1865, the first sheets of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland were sent by the Clarendon Press. Clarendon Press was the name of the Oxford University Press when it moved out of the basement of the Sheldonian Theater. July 15th, Carroll goes to Macmillan and inscribes 20 or more copies of that book. July 19th, he learns of Tenniel's dissatisfaction with the pictures. The next day, he writes, called on Macmillan and showed him Tenniel's letter about the fairy tale. He is dissatisfied with the printing of the pictures, and I suppose we should have to do it all again. July 31st, Carroll writes to Macmillan again, what should you advise me to do with regard to the 2000 from Oxford? The choice seems to lie between these courses. He outlines 5 courses, reserving them to sell in the province, selling them at a reduced price, get Mr. Clay or some experienced man to look them over, and finally, sell the whole as waste paper. On August 1st, Macmillan writes in response to Carroll, sell the copies as waste paper, or perhaps we might sell them a little above that to America. Shall I try? August 2nd, Carroll decides to reprint Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and sell as waste paper the 1952 remaining sheets printed at the Clarendon Press. 1952 rather than 2000 because he had signed and given away 40-some copies. Sometime between September and November, Tenniel writes to Dalziel, Mr. Dodson's book came out months ago. I protested so strongly against the disgraceful printing that he canceled the whole edition. Clay is now doing it for Christmas. April 9th, 1866, Carroll called on Macmillan and spoke to Mr. Craig, who told me the author, they had an offer from America, the man wanting to know what they would charge for 1,000 or 2,000. And on the same day, he called on Tenniel about about the sale of the Clarendon Press sheets to Appleton, and Tenniel consented. On May 26th, Clarendon Press Ledger debits Carroll 13 shillings 6 for 1,000 titles of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland for the American, Appleton that is, edition, printed two pages at once. And this is the ledger, a copy of the ledger page for May 26, 1866. I'll just note here that 4 days before they were printed, William Worthen Appleton and his uncle, Daniel Sidney Appleton, arrived in Boston from Liverpool. As for the proof, next slide. or these are the two versions of the title page. In variant 1, the B of by is directly above the T of Tenniel, and in variant 2, the B is a little to the right of the T in Tenniel. As for the proof that the Appleton books were actually bound in England, here is a copy of the newsprint backing of the spine of the Imholtz copy of the book with London text. Selwyn Goodacre, 40 years ago, identified a London address in the backing of the Schaeffer copy. The address was Old Kent Road, I believe. And so we can be pretty sure that these books actually were bound in London. As a further proof, Vince Golden of the American Antiquarian Society told me that no newspapers in New York were printed in pink or red. Here is William Worth in Appleton. At the age of 21, he had accompanied his uncle, Daniel Sidney Appleton, as I said, to London on a buying trip. He purchased the 1865 sheets, thereby saving them from becoming waste paper. This is what he looked like 4 years after that deal. Daniel Appleton and Company was the largest American publisher in the early 1860s. This is a view of the interior of their bookshop, and this is a view of the exterior of the firm's building. On July 28, 1866, in the Round Table, we find the first announcement of the Appleton Alice. Messrs. The Appleton Company have in press this series of books, including Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. The phrase "in the press" will recur over and over again in the next several months. And a further chronology. On August 12th, the New York Herald, the Appleton Company have in press and will publish in a few days. It actually wasn't a few days. On August 15th, the American Literary Gazette and Publishers Circular noted books recently published in the United States, but manufactured abroad, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Actually, they weren't recently published. On September 16, 1866, we have a notice about the arrival of the Royal Mail Steamer Scotia in Boston, having come from Liverpool. And it has on board London newspapers and books, including Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, a new juvenile by Lewis Carroll with 42 plates by John Tenniel. On November 21st, 1866, we see D. Appleton and Company publish this day Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll with 42 illustrations, etc. On November 28th, 7 days later, the Boston Evening Transcript notices D. Appleton and Company have published a fairy story with 42 quaint illustrations by John Tenniel. The incidents in this marvelous narrative will be pronounced novel by the most experienced juvenile reader of fairy tales, while there is something to tickle the risibilities as well as to give a new sensation to the feeling of wonderful in the adventures it recounts. Tenniel's pictures are capital aids to the text. And as evidence for the attempt to market the book for the holiday market, the New York Observer notes, the Appleton Company have a grand array of gift books and standard works, including Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And it's a curious book, too much like Kingsley's Water Babies, incomprehensible except to children. On December 13th, there appeared the first long review in The Nation. It's over 1,000 words long, and this is just the beginning. It is uniformly positive. The Appleton Alice's record at auction is described in this table from 1894 through 2016. It shows 173 sales. Of course, that doesn't mean 173 different copies of the Appleton Alice were sold. Quite a number of them, I'm sure, were sold more than once. In 1927, when Appleton issued a facsimile of the 1866 Alice, they conducted a survey that yielded only 11 copies. And incidentally, the earliest copies of that 1927 reissue of the Appleton Alice differ because the first couple of copies omitted the frontispiece, a fact noted in her catalog by Flora Livingston of Harvard. Sidney Herbert Williams had a copy of his own, and Mr. Sargent informed him that he thought there were about 50 copies available, 50 copies extant in America at that time. This table shows that John Linseth, Lila Harper, and I have uncovered 102 copies of Appletons in the United States today. There probably are more in private collections, personal collections, or institutional holdings, and people may not even know what they are. This is important because there was a sort of rumor in the official histories, the three official histories of the house of Daniel Appleton and Company, that the books lay in piles on the floor of the store until they took off and disappeared overnight. They couldn't have they couldn't have been neglected because they were clearly being kept for the Christmas market of 1866. Next slide. And finally, the Alice that almost never was. In the announcement section of the December 9th, 1865 issue of the Round Table, a Saturday review of politics, finance, literature, society, and economics, one reads the following. Messrs. Harper and Brothers announce several books, including Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Now, remember that the 1866 London edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, printed by Clay, as Michael Hansher noted, was issued on November 18th, 1866. On December 2nd, the Memoranda and Ledger book of the Harper and Brothers archives, which reside at Columbia University in New York, the record reads, sent to Miss Titcomb by Charles Nordhoff, the editor for Harper's books, including Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. A week later, as I point out, they announced they're going to publish it, but on December 15th, Miss Titcomb reported Alice's Adventures in Wonderland declined for publication. Fletcher Harper, the head of the firm, Charles Nordhoff, the chief editor, and Miss Titcomb, presumably, seldom made mistakes, but they made a very big one, turning down Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. For your patience, listening to this caucus race of a talk, I beg your acceptance of this elegant virtual thimble. Thank you.